Good evening, everyone. I'm Joey Schirkenbach, and here we go with the 2021 to 2022 winter weather forecast. Doing it a bit later, but here we go. As always, when looking at winter weather, there are so many factors to take into account. Sometimes other factors are more important than others, but the first factor to always look at is the Pacific Ocean. So you have an equatorial view here, and typically speaking, you have either a La Nina or an El Nino. Those are two phases of the oceans for every season. And La Nina is the cooling of the waters off the Pacific Ocean. So you notice this big cold pool here. That is indicating a La Nina. So we are going to have a La Nina winter this year. Or you can have El Nino, which is the opposite. That is the warming of the waters off the Pacific Ocean. So rather than blue here, you would see red and some warming in the Pacific Ocean. So this year we have a La Nina winter. And the patterns, it's not as clear-cut as it used to be. And the patterns are going to vary depending on the strength and positioning of the Enso phase, whether it's La Nina or El Nino, whether it's easterly or westerly. For La Nina purposes, a central to easterly based La Nina is the most ideal for a colder eastern United States, which is what we have this year. You notice how the center of the La Nina is on the eastern side. So that would be an ideal sign for a colder than average winter when it comes to the eastern U.S. because that can favor more cold in the eastern U.S. However, a conflicting signal is this cold pool south of Alaska. You notice this is Alaska, and then you have a cold pool. That is indicating a negative PDO, which is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And decadal is a big word in it because it usually lasts for decades, and a lot of times it does not flip from positive to negative right away. It's like takes a long time. And back 10 years ago, we had a consistent positive PDO consistently, and now it's more in that negative phase with no signs of it really changing. So with a negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation and a cold pool right south of Alaska, that would favor a positive EPO, which is a positive East Pacific Oscillation, which would favor cold in Alaska. And a lot of times when it's colder in Alaska, it's milder down in the lower 48, especially the eastern United States. So a trough in Alaska, which is what is forming right now, would favor cold in the eastern United States. That has been the case for the past couple of weeks. However, there are some signs of it changing as we head towards the New Year's. More on that in a little bit later. Now moving on to the Arctic. You have the Pacific, which is the one big player in the weather, and now you have the Arctic. And of course, common discussion is the polar vortex. You think of that simply as a big swirling bowl of really cold air up in the atmosphere, way up in the atmosphere, and has a big player on our weather. And the stronger the polar vortex is, as this model shows, the more contained the cold air is, and you notice how it cannot really come down into the lower 48. It stays in the Arctic, and it just keeps whirling around there. Meanwhile, when it's weaker, or if it gets disrupted, you see the cold air move south, and you notice how it's a much more swirly line here. Milder air can flow into the Arctic, disrupting the polar vortex, allowing cold air to come down south. And the polar vortex is a very hard thing to predict, and you cannot really predict it more than a week or two in advance. For right now, it is on the stronger side. There are some hints of a disruption heading into January, but with it being so far out, as just mentioned, really hard to predict it so far out. So just going to have to watch it for now, but looking at this polar vortex, it has a very big impact on our weather. And another oscillation we look at is the QBO, the Quennial Biennial Oscillation, and that is up in the stratosphere, and the wind is going a certain direction in the stratosphere. It either goes easterly or westerly. And there is no direct correlation, but going back in history, typically speaking, when the QBO is in the easterly phase, it favors colder winters with more high latitude blocking. We'll go over that in a little bit. With it being more in the easterly phase, it would favor that. Meanwhile, when it's in the westerly phase, it favors milder winters with less high latitude blocking. So as this model shows, it is in the predominantly easterly phase, which would be ideal for a colder and snowier winter. However, strength of it matters, and history also shows that if it's too strong, it would not be as impactful and as favorable, as well as a westerly QBO. So it is in the stronger phase right now, but to see it in the easterly phase would be encouraging for the snow fans. Finally, another big oscillation, which going back to the Pacific that we look at, is the MJO, which is the Madden-Julian Oscillation. Now, going back, and this is another big oscillation that we look at, the Madden-Julian Oscillation, so MJO is the abbreviation for it. Now, this is a bit different than other teleconnections. Rather than it having a positive or negative phase, you have a negative EPO, positive EPO, negative NAO. Rather than that, this oscillation has phases. It has 8 different phases, which which all favor a certain weather pattern for the United States. So you notice, as this model shows, the milder phases are 5, 6, and 4. The colder phases are the higher numbers. You have 8, and then going back to 1. Those are the colder phases. Now, the MJO can move around, and a lot of times it gets locked into certain phases. For right now, we have a milder pattern in general right now. It looks to continue for the next couple weeks. That is partially because of the MJO. It is in the phase 6, and notice that is the warmest phase at this time of year for the eastern U.S., favorite southeast region, which is what we have right now. However, heading into the New Year's, you do see a little bit of a change showing up. It's not evident and it's not totally guaranteed. However, there are some hints of it moving into the phase 7 and phase 8, and notice those are much colder phases. So that would perhaps preclude to a colder pattern shaping up around the New Year's time frame. And to see it in an upper air pattern and just kind of see what I'm talking about, this would be a pattern that might show up late in New Year's. This is just a model projection. However, it has been consistent with the past several runs, so it is worth looking at. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times when you have a trough in Alaska, which is a positive EPO, that favors more ridging in the east, as well as Greenland. Now, this map is modified a little bit, but you notice Greenland here with a lot of ridging, or as it's called, high latitude blocking. So high latitude blocking is simply ridging in Greenland and in the Arctic that stays there, not exactly transit. And with it showing up in the Arctic, that can impact the polar vortex down the road. The more warmth there is in the Arctic, the higher chances there are for a disruption. Meanwhile, if it's really cold in the Arctic, there's no warmth to get in there, so a lot of times that lets the polar vortex circulate and stay very strong. So with this map, you notice how a ridge is trying to push into Alaska. That is a negative EPO, which would favor more troughing in the eastern U.S., as this is shown here. But then, to buck that, you have the southeast ridge. And in La Nina winters, almost all the time, there is a southeast ridge that is trying to flex, and it's trying to push up northward. Now, sometimes it's successful, and you get a whole eastern U.S. ridge. Other times, it's not so successful, and it just impacts the southeast, but it can't really flex up into the northeast. And that is the biggest impact. So high latitude blocking can kind of decide what that ridge does. So if there's a lot of blocking in Greenland, that can kind of prevent the southeast ridge from flexing. It's called high latitude blocking. Notice blocking the ridge from flexing. Meanwhile, when there's not high latitude blocking, that can let the ridge flex more. So as this is showing, you see the ridge here in the southeast, and again, flexing, but it's really not successful because the blocking is kind of squashing it down. So if that happens, that can let colder air flow into the eastern U.S., and it can also let more storms develop and let storms take a bigger coastal track and some amplification in there as well. However, another thing to keep in mind is where the ridge in Alaska sets up, because if the ridge stays in the Aleutians, which is the islands in southwest Alaska, this strip here, that for some reason is kind of like a kiss of death, and it really impacts whether the ridge is in the Aleutians or Alaska, where the pattern steps up and where the cold sets up. Also looking at some troughing in the western U.S., that is a negative PNA, which is the Pacific North American Oscillation. And with there being a negative PNA and no real signs of it going positive, that could favor the cold to plunge down into the plains in the western U.S., but it could have a harder time pushing all the way east, especially with a southeast ridge to battle. And that is why the high latitude blocking is so important, because if it can squash the ridge to a point, then the cold can come through. But if the ridge flexes, it can kind of fight off the cold. So it's going to be a battle here, and this would not take place until, if we were to get any real cold pattern, it would not take place till late December, probably not even until January, but it is something to watch. So now, the month-by-month breakdown of winter weather. Because it's almost mid-December now, I have to start with the rest of December. So right now, safe to say the next couple weeks, at least up into the Christmas time frame, look mild. Especially this week, it looks quite mild. Again, the southeast ridge really going to flex. So mild the next 2 weeks. However, I do think we're going to start seeing a shift to colder times as we close out the month. So towards New Year's, I do think it will start to turn colder. I don't expect any epic Arctic blast, but I do expect the overall pattern to turn a bit colder as we head towards New Year's. And January, which is kind of the center month, the month where, you never know what can happen. It can be really warm, it can be really cold, it could be a roller coaster ride. So because I expect a colder end to December, I expect that to continue into January. In fact, it might even get colder and stormier in January. If the blocking can really develop and the ridging in Alaska can cooperate, or the Pacific can cooperate, then I think this will preclude to a cold start to January as well as storming. Question is, how long does it last? And it's really, really hard to predict that so far out. But if it can last longer, January would be filled with wintry weather. But if not, it might back off a little bit, especially as we get to the second half. So I expect a lot of flip-flopping taking place in the second half. A colder, dominant start, but then perhaps flip-flopping, and I think we're going to see the Southeast Ridge try and flex more in the second half. And February, which loves to be a spring month around here to get everyone excited for an early spring, but then March comes in and ruins all the fun. So February really could go either way. I think this is going to be another month where the Southeast Ridge is really going to try and flex. But a big question here is what happens in the stratosphere. So what happens with the polar vortex? Does it get disrupted? Now, no signs of a disruption yet. However, there are signs of it weakening as we get into January. And weakening can take a long time, or it can also take a short time. But if there's gradual weakening taking place in January, that can lead up to a bigger disruption or even a split. And if the polar vortex splits or gets disrupted, and you get one of the lobes over the eastern U.S., which is no guarantee, sometimes the polar vortex can split on the other side of the globe, and we get pretty much no impact here in New England. But if it does split on New England's side of the globe, that could, again, create a lot of high latitude blocking and squash the Southeast Ridge and prevent it from flexing, which would lead to a much colder and more wintry February. However, it's very, very questionable, and it's all just really hard to say. So the stratosphere could totally ruin this forecast, and we'll see what happens. For now, I expect February to be on the mild side. I think the Southeast Ridge is really going to make its appearance in the eastern U.S., and it's going to be an active pattern. However, with a strong Southeast Ridge, that's going to favor milder conditions, so therefore probably more rain events, probably more storms that track west of the coast. So I think snow will be hard to come by in February. However, the stratosphere could change that. Now, I do not have a graphic for March, but I think March is always going to be the roller coaster ride. Now, back a few years ago, March used to always be a wintry month. It would always bring the nor'easters. The past couple years, March has been on the milder side, believe it or not. I expect March to be a very back and forth pattern. I think the first half is going to have a lot of chances for wintry weather, but then as March goes on, the average temperatures go up, so you need much colder air to work with if you're going to get a snowstorm. So I think March will have a lot of flip-flopping, but I also think the best chance of snow would come in the first half. Now, April, on the other hand, could really go either way also. It has been on the colder side the past couple of years, but very unlikely for April to be brutally cold like it was a few years ago. Now, the final and official snowfall prediction for what falls at Logan Airport in Boston. Now, granted, this is the forecast for Boston along the coast. I expect the interior to get more. A lot of times, especially early in the season, you get onshore wind, which warms the water, so therefore gives them less snow, more mixing. But this is the call for the coast and Boston, going with 25 to 35 inches. So, another below average snowfall year. The average snowfall is about 43 inches in Boston, so I'm expecting a below average year, but not a total dud year. I think there's going to be a lot of chances, and of course, it always comes down to a couple storms. Do these couple storms hit? Do they miss? Do they go inside? It can really come down to just a couple storms to see how they pan out. But for now, going with 25 to 35 inches, could bust really high, could bust really low. Time will tell. So that is going to do it for this forecast. I hope you all enjoyed this. We will see if it verifies. If it verifies well, great. If it doesn't, it's a learning experience. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you next weekend.